Good to see everyone in 2023, which it's just amazing that it's such a blessing that December 25th occurred on Sunday, and now January 1st occurs on Sunday. So if you're a person of resolutions, this is a time to be thinking about those kinds of things. But even if you're not a person of resolutions, I'd like to recommend one, and that is read the book of Psalms. That's where we've been for the last few weeks, and I just encourage you to read the Psalms. I know for an absolute fact that you will be blessed in having done so. And just start with Psalm 1 and just work your way through the book to Psalm 150. Just let God speak to you through the Psalms. It will be indeed a blessing for you. Today we're going to finish up our look into Book 2 within the Book of Psalms. As we discussed in our first class, Psalms is broken up into 5 books in your Bible. And you'll see the heading inscriptions. Book 2 runs from Psalm 42 through Psalm 72. And we looked 2 weeks ago. We didn't have class on Christmas Day, but 2 weeks ago we took a look at Psalm 42 and 43. And again, I encourage you that Psalm 42 and 43 are taken by most people that know a lot more about this stuff than I do, that they were written together, intended to be read together. And I encourage you to do the same. Psalms 42 and 43 introduced us to the sons of Korah. And we talked about the sons of Korah. You can go back into the book of Chronicles and book of Samuel even and see where David was setting up the worship routines for the eventual temple. Not only for the tabernacle, but then eventually the temple that he was not allowed to build, but his son Solomon did. And part of that was appointing from the tribe of Levi, appointing musicians and singers and setting up the liturgy of the temple worship system that was developed. And a lot of that resulted in the book of Psalms. Not all, but a lot of the Psalms were originally intended to be sung and were written as songs. The book of Psalms, especially in modern Jewish liturgy, is used much more as a prayer book than as a psalm book. But we derive from the book of Psalms a lot of our hymns and devotional songs. A lot of popular Christian music uses the Psalms as a resource to provide them with information and verses in which to sing. So it's just a wonderful book. It's so rich. And one of the things that we learn through the book of Psalms is how we can communicate with God and how God communicates with us. And that's reflected. Today we're going to take a look at Psalms 61, 62, and 63. These are all Psalms of David. We talked about book 1, the first book that we looked at within the book of Psalms, the first 41 Psalms were mostly written by David. When you get into book 2, you have a lot more writers introduced. David still writes quite a few within book 2, but there are a lot more writers of different Psalms that are introduced to us, the sons of Korah being one. But in Psalm 61, 62, and 63, in just a moment, I'm going to read not all of those 3 Psalms, but I'm going to read some excerpts. The things I'm going to leave out is when David's talking about his enemies, because we'll save that for a little bit later. But Psalm 61, 62, and 63, there are 2 things that I want you to listen for. And the first one is that David's confidence is in God. It's not in himself. It's not in any man. It's not in the world around him. His confidence, the source of his ability to know who he is and what he should be doing, is based in this relationship with God. And it's important for us to understand when we look at the Old Testament and we use terms, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, we use terms like Elohim or Adonai or Yahweh when we're talking about God. We're also talking about Jesus Christ. So in the New Testament era, we always look back from the cross at everything that preceded it. And we know through the, many places, but in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So speaking of Jesus Christ. So anytime we're looking at the Old Testament and we're talking about God, and God is in control and God is who we serve, Jesus is included in that entire statement. But we don't need to be confused about that. God and Jesus are one and the same, and yet they're different. But in Psalm 61, 62, and 63, David expresses many times this absolute confidence that he has in God. You'll see he'll use terms like, put me on the rock that is higher than I. Elevate me above where I am right now. He will use lots of different terms that we'll see. He'll talk about God being his hope, God being his salvation, God being everything that's going to be good about him. I also want you to look for these expressions, especially in Psalm 63, this desire that David has, this longing to be in relationship with God. C.S. Lewis wrote a short devotional book called Reflections on the Psalms. It's a very beautiful book that kind of skips like a stone across a little pond through the Psalms. And C.S. Lewis does what C.S. Lewis does best in presenting it to us. But in talking about Psalm 63 and some other places within Reflection on the Psalms, C.S. Lewis states that it's very clear that the psalmists have an appetite for God. They have this desire. In the same way that we may be at times in our life, be hungry, and we have this desire for something in particular, whatever it may be, your favorite restaurant in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, or whatever that might be. But we have this desire to the point sometimes physically we salivate thinking about, mom's cooking or some other place that we like and we enjoy the food. C.S. Lewis makes the association that it's very clear within the book of Psalms that we have that so many of the writers have this longing, this yearning, this desire to be embedded deeply within this relationship with God. And that's very, very true of David, and it's very, very true of these three Psalms that we're going to look at today. So with that, we'll take a look at Psalms 61, 62, and 63. I encourage you to read along with me. I am going to skip through the Psalms, so I'm going to leave out a couple of parts, so just try to keep up as best you can. Starting in Psalm 61, verse 1. Hear my cry, O God. Listen to my prayer. From the ends of the earth I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shelter of your wings. For you have heard my vows, O God. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. Increase the days of the king's life, his years for many generations. May he be enthroned in God's presence forever. Appoint your love and faithfulness to protect him. Then I will ever sing praise to your name and fulfill my vows day after day. My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. On my bed, I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night. Because you are my help, I sing in the shadow of your wings. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. So within those passages from Psalms 61, 62, and 63, I think we can all see this confidence that David places in his relationship with God. When David is in trouble, he goes to God. When David is feeling good about things, he praises God. When David has doubts in his life, he goes to God. He reflects upon those things that he knows are true. And the only thing that is absolute truth is God. And that's where David centers his life. Even though we know through reading about David's history that there are a lot of times that he went his own way. You know, David's life was not a life of purity. David had issues. David had trouble. But as is explained to us, David was a man after God's own heart. He had this desire, this yearning to be in relationship with him at all times. And that confidence is what he held on to. The other thing that we see this longing, this desire, and it's reflected so many times throughout the Old Testament, and we can see it in many of the Psalms. If you've been reading through the Psalms, you have come across a lot of phraseology of, especially in the lament Psalms, we've talked about this, where the desire of the writer is for God to look upon them. Okay, to shine his face toward them. And sometimes if we miss some of the understanding of what that is all about. But it's like if we had a really good friend or companion that we trust, a person that we go to in times of trouble for counsel. You know, it may be a parent, it may be a good friend, it may be your spouse, but somebody that when we are really trying to figure something out in our lives, someone that we turn to and ask them their opinion about something that is going on in our lives. And we do that because we value what it is they have to say. We trust what it is that they have to say. And that is the type of relationship that David has with God, and that we are encouraged to have ourselves with our Father God, is that we can go to Him and talk about anything in our lives, and we know that we are going to receive truth. We know that we are going to receive nothing but good from God the Father. 2 weeks ago, one of the things that we introduced with Book 2 was this concept of the Elohistic Psalter is the term that you'll come across in some books if you choose to read them. But the Elohistic Psalter extends from Psalm 42 to Psalm 83. So just a brief reminder of what that is. In the vast majority of the Psalms, the term for God is probably translated in your Bibles as capital L-O-R-D or capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, the Lord. Okay, when you see that in your Bibles, typically that's where the Hebrew word YWYH is located. Okay, 4 consonants. We transliterate that typically as Yahweh, the name for God. Starting in Psalm 42 and going through Psalm 83, that changes. Yahweh is only used a few times, a handful of times. The majority of the time, the term used for God is Elohim or some variation thereof, such as El, but it's Elohim. Don't really know why that occurs. Don't know the influence that was involved, particularly why that happens. We just know it is. The book of Psalms is a collection of collections. So apparently at some point in Israel's history, there was a collection of psalms written during a date and time where the term Elohim was very important. And those psalms were brought into our current book of Psalms, and they primarily exist in Psalms 42 through 83. But the Elohistic Psalter. As David is writing and crying out to God, we typically see the word Elohim in these 3 psalms. And also the term El. Again, the basic reasoning of why the change we don't understand, but it is a familiarity within the time and the place of who God was. And it was a declaration that in the midst of a pagan world that surrounded the nation of Israel, David was very mindful that there was only one true Elohim. There was only one true El. And it was the El that the Israelites served, which we know typically as Yahweh. Another thing that happens that we miss in our translations today is we talked briefly about this word Chesed. David, in his presentation on the book of Ruth over the last couple of months, introduced us to this word Chesed. It's a lot of times translated as faithful love or loving kindness in the King James Version and the New American Standard. The old way of translating it was the word loving kindness. Sometimes in more modern translations it may be translated as faithful love, or it has the word love and faithfulness kind of in the same sentence. And that happens here within Psalms 61, 62, and 63. As David is declaring his absolute trust and confidence in God, his trust and confidence is in God's Chesed. So, one of the things that we have to fundamentally understand is that God never fails us. God's faithfulness is absolute. And we can know that as Christians. We can absolutely, regardless of what our life has been or looks like, we can have confidence in that because we can look back at what is provided us in the Old Testament stories, at what is provided us within the New Testament. Jesus Christ himself is the quintessential evidence that we need to know that God is faithful to his promises. He is faithful to those people who fear him. He is faithful to his children. And the blessings that we are promised are ours as his children. We can absolutely trust in that. David, in these 3 brief Psalms, in other Psalms, and in other places, David absolutely trusted in that. Even when he was in real despair and in bad times, he trusted that regardless of what might happen to him or what might be occurring in the moment, he knew that God was faithful. God will work it out. David Young has said many, many times to us, he's reminded us, sometimes the blessings that we have in our relationship with God may not materialize within our lifetime. And here's an example of that. David says in Psalm 61, in verse 5, the last part of verse 5, "You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name." It is important for us to realize the impact that we individually can have within our families and with other people in our circle on our righteousness. David is talking today in his introduction to the book of Colossians about the fact that we have to realize that we are holy people. You know, Peter says in 1 Peter that be holy because you are holy, because God is holy. And since we serve a holy God, we need to be holy ourselves in everything that we do and everything that we practice. And this is what David is referring to. And as we progress through the Psalms, in a couple of weeks, we'll be taking a look at Psalm 111 and 112. Psalm 111 is all about the righteousness of God. The same phraseology used in Psalm 111 is also used in Psalm 112, but the subject changes. It's not about the righteousness of God. It's about the righteousness of men and women who fear God and serve Him. And perhaps you've never thought of yourself in that way. You've never thought of yourself as being holy. You've never thought of yourself as being righteousness. That's something we aspire to, but it's something that we never get. We couldn't be more wrong in that kind of theology. As you read through the New Testament, we're told over and over again that we are a holy people. We are sanctified. We have been purified. We have been made righteous. It's in your DNA if you're a Christian. Be that. Act that way. And that's what David is alluding to here in Psalm 61 in this simple little phrase, "You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name." Now, you may not come from a heritage of believers. I do. I can look back many generations and be thankful for people in my family that chose a life of faith. Were they perfect? No. But the example that I have from them is not their imperfection, it's their perfection. The example that I rely upon from them is this heritage of faith that's been handed to me. And that I attempt to hand on to my children and my grandchildren. And it may not be something that I realize, just as I'm sure that no one in my background, other than my parents and perhaps my grandparents, had hoped one day that I would be a person of faith. But there were generations before that were faithful, that never had any idea the influence that they would have on me in this day and this time. I'm fortunate to have some family Bibles that have been handed down through generations. And the things that are most precious are the little handwritten notes the annotations of things that were important to them. And I know from our family history and from reading about what I know about people generations before me is that they were people of faith. And that I am a result of that. And I am thankful for that blessing that I have. And this is what David is expressing here when he says, "You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name." If you don't have that in your family background, start the chain. You be the person in your family that starts a heritage of righteousness. You may not realize the blessing in your lifetime, but there will be someone down the road that will. And this is how I can be so confident in that. We read many times in the Old Testament, specifically in the book of Deuteronomy, you'll come across phrases where curses extend to the third and fourth generation, sometimes even to the 10th generation. Okay, we come across that language. We don't totally understand it because it's in a different time and place. All right, well, this is how we can understand it. You think about curses today. It has been well documented. I've read this as not as a scholar, not as a researcher, but substance abuse. Substance abuse in a family, when it starts, usually is transgenerational. The curse of substance abuse goes beyond just the initial person that was involved in it. It usually extends down the line, and it takes generations for it to be removed from the family. Poverty is intergenerational. Poverty is something that can be passed from one generation to the next. Not because people want it to, but it just is. And it may be several generations before a family comes out of poverty. So we know this relationship between curses, as it says in the Old Testament, bad events that occur in life today, and we see its effect on families and how it's intergenerational. The same thing is true, though, of righteousness. Righteousness can transcend generations. The righteousness that you strive for today, that you try to exhibit in your life and in your choices and in your relationship with God, will be extended for generations. That's the promise that we have in Psalm 112. When we get to that and we read that, we'll bring this whole subject up again. But I can't emphasize it enough. It is so important. What you do today is not just for you. It's not just for your spouse. It's not just for your immediate family. It's for the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren that are going to come years from now. Be a blessing of righteousness and holiness for your family. It doesn't matter how small the righteousness is. Pass it on. Let the next generation pick it up and expand upon it. And that's what David is talking about here. We ended the study with the book of Ruth, that David Young was bringing to us. In the entire study of the book of Ruth, chapter 4 ends with a genealogy. Ruth and Boaz have Obed, and then it ends up with Jesse, the father of David. So they provided Israel with the greatest king that Israel still celebrates today, that we as Christians still celebrate today. They took the righteousness that they chose in their day and their time. Ruth in her loyalty to her mother-in-law. Ruth in accepting the faith that her mother-in-law had. Boaz in adhering to the righteousness of what God wanted for his people in being the kinsman redeemer for Ruth and Naomi. It was those actions that led eventually to King David and the blessings that he provided to the nation of Israel for generations and to us, and participated in the heritage and lifeline of Jesus Christ himself. Don't second guess the impact that you can have as an individual upon your family, upon your circle around you, upon where you are in your time and place in history, on what's going to happen in the future. We have this promise. David alludes to it here in Psalm 61. It's told to us very directly in Psalm 112 that your heritage of righteousness, your heritage of being a God-fearing person, your heritage of having a relationship with God and with Jesus Christ will transcend generations and serve as a blessing to your children and the generations to follow. David also discusses, the part that we didn't read, are some of the things that were going on in his life. We know that the allusion in the superscription of Psalm 63 is a psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah. So this was either when he was running away from Saul or he may have been running away from Absalom. David spent a lot of time in the desert. Okay? He spent a lot of time in the wilderness hiding in caves and just hiding from his enemies, people that wanted to kill him. So David was very familiar with what the desert was all about. And when he writes these verses, these beautiful verses for us in Psalm 63, talks about a dry and weary land. So any of you that have ever been to the desert, first appearance can seem very bleak. I've had the opportunity in my life to spend quite a bit of time in desert, and it's, I try to describe it, it's like a watercolor with just shades of brown and gray. But within that brown and gray, there are absolute blessings. There's a lot of beauty in the desert. There's a lot of wonder. And one of those things is when you come across water. And the change, the transformation that can occur in a small area of God's earth with the introduction of water. So you can be in it where everywhere you look, the four corners of the compass, when you look, can be nothing but shades of gray and brown. But when you see life, when you see green, when you see anything that's different, you know there's water there. And this is the depiction that David is providing us with. That when he was in a dry and weary land where there was no water, that God provided him with everything that he needed. The other thing to point out here in these three passages, David uses several times the terminology of being under God's wings, of being in his tent. Okay, if you haven't thought about it, he's talking about the tabernacle. We know through the history of David, we see several times when he went into the tabernacle itself. We know that the mercy seat had the wings of the cherubim upon it. And David would go there. He was very familiar with it. He had knowledge of it. Later on, when Solomon built the first temple, where the Ark of the Covenant sat, they had even larger cherubim with wingtips that went from wall to wall and wingtip to wingtip. So when David is talking about, he didn't see the first temple, he wasn't present, but this imagery that he's presenting to us, he's very, very well aware of the Ark of the Covenant, what it looked like, and the mercy seat where God sat with these cherubim wings spread out. This is what David is talking about. I know when I sit beneath your wings that I am safe. We have that same blessing today. Don't take the knowledge we have of the tabernacle and the temple lightly just because we're Christians and the temple no longer exists. It was destroyed in AD 70. And don't let that imagery be lost upon you. You, as a person of God today, sit underneath God's wings. His wings of protection, His wings of sustenance, His wings of love and faithfulness. They're there for us all the time. I've cited this verse before. If you know me well, you're probably tired of hearing it. Well, I doubt if you're tired of hearing it, but I tend to say it a lot. James chapter 4, verse 8. If we turn to God, God will turn to us. James was very knowledgeable. Most people think that the James that provided us with the book of James was the brother of Christ. He's very knowledgeable of the temple and all the history. And what he establishes for us, what he reminds us of, is our God is not far away somewhere. He's not distant from us. He's near. He's right here. All God has to do, if He isn't already looking at us, is turn His head. It is no different than those of us who are parents, or if you observe parents, holding a child's hand. And you can usually tell if a child and a parent are walking along and the child is a little unsure of something they see ahead of them, they usually look up at their parent. And if the parent typically parents are aware of this, and they look down, all it takes is a comforting word or a smile. The child's fine. The child is okay. They know that they are protected. We have this same loving, faithful relationship with God our Father. We rest beneath His wings, just like we read about in the Psalms, just like we're reading about here in Psalms 61, 62, and 63. When we are fearful, when we are doubtful, when we have trouble, all we have to do is turn to God. God turns to us. But it's a loving parent's turn to look upon us, to put His face upon us. A lot of the Psalms, especially the lament Psalms, will be requesting God to please don't turn your face away from me or look upon me with favor. Because they know that this relationship we have with God, there's not a great chasm that separates us. He's right here. All we have to do is turn towards Him, and He turns towards us. That's all that's expected. But we can have great confidence and great trust in God's loving kindness, His chesed that is poured out upon us, that's available to us. It's low-hanging fruit. We can readily just grab it and have it to cherish and to hold on to. And He gives it willingly to those who fear Him, to those who are His children. That is the promise that we have. David asked in Psalm 61 in verses 6 and 7 that we didn't read. He says, "Increase the days of the king's life, his years for many generations. May he be enthroned in God's presence forever. Appoint your love and faithfulness to protect him." This is David's petition to God. So it's a little bit of a lament inserted within a psalm that also has a lot of good things to say about God. But David, it starts off, Psalm 61 verse 1, I'm crying out, hear me, O God, hear my petition. And this is part of the petition. Increase the days of my life. Now, we don't know whether this was before God had given his promise to David. It was more than likely after he had given his promise to David that he was going to establish him and his kingdom, so his kingship forever. It doesn't mean that David was never going to die, but that his kingship would last. And we know that that was fulfilled and embodied within Jesus Christ himself. God is always faithful to his promises. He's always true to us. And David, here in a period of doubt, perhaps thinks that, well, maybe God is going to renege on this promise. And he asked God not to do that. David was that human, just as we are, to have doubts from time to time of God's blessings coming our way. But that's part of David's petition. And he asked God for his chesed, his love and faithfulness, to protect him. And he says, and in some ways it's kind of it's written as a challenge. Don't think we should take it that way. He says in verse 8, then will I ever sing praise to your name and fulfill my vows day after day. So, in the language, it seems like David is saying, okay, if you do this, then I will do this. Whereas we know that the bulk of the Old Testament and New Testament tells us that there are things that we have to do on our end. Even James 4:8, the passage that I love to remember because it gives me hope. God is right here, but we've got to turn toward him. Just like the parent walking with their small child. The child has to turn their head up for the parent to kind of sense that something's going on, and the parent looks down. It's the same in our relationship with God. You go back in the beginnings of the book of Exodus, I believe it's in Exodus 4, a passage it's kind of haunting in many ways. But the nation of Israel had been in Egypt for some time, and Joseph had died, and they were still there. And then a Pharaoh came up that knew neither Joseph nor the God that they served, or, what are all these Canaanite Israelites doing here? And they were put into slavery. And they were in slavery for some time. And they were crying out to God. And then the passage that we have, and I believe it's in Exodus 4, perhaps Exodus 2. But God heard their cries. They were lamenting. God heard their laments. And he looked upon them with favor. And he remembered, oh yeah, I made these promises to Abraham and Jacob and Isaac, and I'm going to be true to my promise. And that's when the story of the book of Exodus, the story is laid out where God he raises Moses up. He brings the nation of Israel out of Egypt, and they go through the wilderness, and then they eventually go into the promised land. God remembers. God is true to his people. But sometimes we got to let him know. Why that is, I don't know. But we've got to let him know. I think of it as a parent. We had 4 children. But Cindy and I, a lot of times We have some children that tell you everything that's going on in their lives. Whether you want to hear it or not, they tell you everything. It's their open book. You have other children that are very closed up. They keep everything very close to the vest. And sometimes as a parent, you know something's going on, and you just have to kind of, pry it open to get them to share with you. But you do that not because you're wanting to punish people, not because you want to instill fear in them. It's because you love them. And you want them to know they can trust you and that you want nothing but the best for them. It's the same in our relationship with God. God doesn't expect everything to be Pollyannish in our relationship with Him. He knows, we're full of trouble. The world is full of trouble. The book of Job, the book of Ecclesiastes tells us this directly. There's just trouble. Whether it's of our own doing or whether it's things in life that just happen to us. God doesn't need us to tell Him what's going on. He knows already. What He wants, though, is this relationship where even though He knows something's wrong, He wants to hear us say it. He wants us to lament to Him about what's going on in our life, what's going on around us. He wants to hear us petition Him to do something. And it's no different than how most of us probably are with our children. I know that's how, as a father, that's how I've always been. Sometimes, Cindy is a lot more intuitive to what things that go on in our children's lives than I am. Sometimes I'm just, it's like I have blinders on. But I know this. Anytime our children have something going on, whether it's good, whether it's bad, I want to know. I want to react to it. If it's good, I want to praise with them. I want to celebrate with them. If it's bad, I want to help them through it. I want our children to know, and I hope they know, I think they know, good or bad, I will always be there for them. And I don't do that just because I'm Peter Patton and, I'm some kind of wonderful person. I do that because God made me that way. We are created in the likeness of God. The feelings and the attachment that we have as parents, the goodness of that relationship with our children, that comes from God. And that is the relationship that God has with us. That is the relationship that God has with us. So, with that, we'll close out our look at Psalms 61 and 62 and 63. I encourage you to keep reading through the Psalms. Next week, we will pick up with Book 3, starting in Psalm 73. We'll pick some Psalms out of there and take a look at for the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much, and have a blessed day.